It's good to be back. It's actually good to be back with people in the pews. You recall, most of my tenure here as the interim was via the camera and with just a tea and perhaps one or two others in the and hidden away from the camera view. That I spent most of my time with you, so it's nice to actually be able to see folks here. So it's good to be back. I'm glad to be able to cover for Jake. I am also spending my time, in addition to teaching at seminaries these days, helping out at Christ Church Rye. So that's kind of what occupies myself most of these Sundays. I wanted to speak about this morning about the passage in the Old Testament that T read this morning that speaks about Abram's vision and then his dream. I was, it's that time of year, I was making or boiling down my maple sap this week, and it's, you know, that time of year, if you make a fire, it's not going to be without a lot of smoke and a lot of steam billowing off. It was a nice day, but it was still cool. So I had the fire going outside because you don't want to, by the way, ever boil down sap inside your house. The humidity is such that you'll just have a sweet sticky coat all of your kitchen walls and beyond. So if you've ever done that, I didn't make that mistake. But regardless, so I had my fire going outside and my pot of sap on it, and it takes a while because you have to boil down almost all of it to get to the maple syrup. And the smoke, it was a smoky fire because it was cold, and it takes a while to get the sap boiling. And so this fire was boiling there and billowing up smoke, and it was rather disorientating because every time I go over to tend to the fire, put more wood on it, inevitably I'd wind up my eyes burning with the smoke and so blind and turning away, and the bitter taste of the fire in my mouth and trying to not burn myself as I'm adding logs and moving the pot on and off the fire as it was going and as the pot began to boil. And so you have to tend to it, and you kind of have to keep listening to what's happening because you can't always see the fire underneath the pot. And so it takes really all of your senses to be involved in this process, and so it can be overwhelming and difficult to experience. And yet, regardless, at the end, as you know, you wind up with a small amount of maple syrup at the end, which, by the way, I did, and it's delicious. It's well worth the endeavor of really most of a day just boiling down some sap. And the sap is still running, so in case you're interested in doing this, you still have time. And I may throw my pots back up on the trees to see if I collect more of the sap and do it again. I think I have enough, but I might want to make some for my son, for him to have. So if we look back into the Genesis Old Testament reading, we find Abraham who is disheartened and will become disoriented. We have in Genesis 15 the second time that God has come to Abram. And notice it's Abram because his name hasn't been changed yet. We still have one more time around before that happens. So it's Abram here who's received this vision from God. And that we can break it down into a few things. God, or what we would call Yahweh, or we might know as Jehovah, is translated into English as Yahweh. He starts out that verse with a fundamental that fundamental promise they has in 15:1. The word of the Lord came in a vision. Do not be afraid. I am your shield. Your reward shall be great. So we have a promise of reward that has been made to Abram. Notice he hasn't done anything to receive that promise. You can go back through the chapters. In fact, he did leave Ur, but he's not quite the epitome yet of the greatness that he will become. And what do we get, or what does God get at that vision in response to this promise? He gets a complaint, right? He says, God, this may be the case. I might have a great reward, but when am I going to have a kid? I mean, come on. Right now, I'm going to have to leave all of my belongings, my wealth that I have accumulated, to the heir of my house, who is Eliezer of Damascus. He has no offspring. Neither him nor Sarah are able to produce offspring yet. So he returns, as you can kind of think of Moses too here about the complaint to God. You've made this promise, but thanks. So we have him saying, there is no heir, but the word of the Lord comes to him again, and we see in verses 4 and 5, this man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, look at the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. This is the other time is that visitation, God will say, look at the sand on the beach, and can you count the grains of sand on the beach? So we have this promise of heirs, of multiple generations that will follow Abram. Abram is not convinced, I think. It takes him a while, Sarah even longer, but eventually they do come around to this, right, when we have Isaac born. Of course, we see Abram, though he's received this promise, it gets impatient, and Sarah, both of them get impatient, and therefore we have Hagar and Ishmael, and that story that'll be coming up. The drama in this section of Genesis is quite high. So what does God say? He said, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur to give you this land. But he says, oh, Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Really. So what does God do? He says, okay, we're going to have a liturgical act here. We're going to set a symbolic, ritualistic moment, experience for you. And he says, go get all sorts of animals. It's quite the sacrifice he has to make, with both a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brings them, and he cuts the larger animals in half. And then we find, of course, that he is burning these animals and as an offering to God, and it's drawing the ravens to come, and he has to shoo them away. And that's where we're left in this portion. We as we like to do in the biblical readings at times, we like to skip a few verses. It makes it more convenient, I guess, but it does interrupt what was going on here. God has to then repeat to Abram, his promise and what he has done for him. So then it picks up. So we've had this vision, and as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. This is God causing him to fall into a deep sleep. A deep, terrifying darkness descends upon him. So we have the power of God showing up here to reinforce what's going on, to reinforce the liturgical act, to reinforce the vision. And when the sun had gone down, again, This is Abram now asleep. It was dark. A smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. What are the pieces? The pieces of the offering. And so we could translate a smoking fire pot into an oven. So we have this dream here that's going on. And in that dream, the Lord God makes a covenant with Abram. To your descendants I will give this land from the river Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And so this is the covenant of land that has been given to Abram and his descendants, and it's tying the relationship up between God and Abram and the descendants, the Jewish, as we know them today, the Jewish people. Why was Abram's dream notable? I mean, we all have dreams, right? We all have moments where we wake up and have had a dream. But it's important here to note that Abram has taken the time to note this dream. It was not enough that he had the vision. I mean, how many people have a vision of God, where God speaks directly to them, right? And then there's this ritualistic sacrifice, but it has to be also solidified with this mystical event, this dream that happens that's terrifying to Abram. What we should note about dreams is one, in particular here, why it's important for Abram is it ties the relationship together. It really solidifies the relationship between Abram and God in a way that's important. The other thing to note is, well, why did the editors that collected Moses and the editors that collected these writings and created the Torah, why did they say, we need to include the dream here. We need to include this terrifying moment as well. So it's this powerful moment of God's ability to communicate at multiple levels that's going on here, what the editors and Moses wanted us to note. God often communicates in dreams. It's not unusual. We know this from the New Testament, don't we? We've seen the readings. Think of just a few weeks ago, hard to believe, during Christmastide, that we had the dreams and visitations of the angel to Mary, and then later the dreams to Joseph, that to stay in betrothal to Mary, and then later to flee from Bethlehem to Egypt to protect his family from Herod. So we have God in many times visiting in dreams. So it's not unusual to have a dream. This is not something that would be outside the norm of what's going on. And dreams tend to be disorientating. They tend to be disruptive. They're meant to cause us to stop and ponder. If you've had one of those dreams at night that wake you up in the morning or in the middle of the night and you're kind of wondering what's happening, you probably kind of spend the rest of the day thinking about them and thinking, well, what was that dream? Kind of stays with you on and off throughout the day. And you wonder if you're going to fall, at the end of the day, you might even wonder if you're going to fall back into that dream later on. And so the next night. And often it doesn't. But that's the power of dreams that can have over us. They are symbolic, particularly those in the Bible. They're meant to provide us with symbols of God's action and God's ability to communicate. They can be symbolic to other people, as all of us as well. We can have a dream that we can think about and stay with us. And if you are into Jungian psychology, then you would know that Jungian's desire, teaching about dreams and the importance of dreams and the archetypes that go on there. So dreams have this significance that can stay with us on multiple levels. They allow us to interpret them. And that's perhaps when we get up and say, well, what did that dream mean? What is that? What was that? I often have my wife will say, I had this dream, and she wonders, so-and-so was in it. And she's like, should I call them? Should I check in on them because they were in my dream? And I said, well, if that was the case, in my dreams, I'd be calling people every morning. By the way, I dreamt about you. Are you okay today? Because the host of people that could be in a dream that I have are many. And it can be a bit frustrating. It's like, really? All of these people are in a dream? So it allows, it's a part of our space and time that allows for us to have interpretation, to understanding. The mind is at work in a mysterious way. In this case, this dream, it's a terrifying and filled with darkness. It creates a sense of foreboding and a symbolism that heightens Abram's relationship, his growing relationship with God, and shows God's acceptance of that sacrifice that he's made. It's not enough that God spoke to Abram in a dream, in a vision. He has to have a dream that goes with this. It is the sacrifice is being bound into the life of Abram and his descendants in not just a physical sense, but also in a mystical sense. This means what God is saying here is God is all in. He is committed to this relationship, that there is no turning back, that there is nothing that Abram has to do to signify or to better the relationship. God has made his choice here. It's interesting to note that Paul in Hebrews and in other places will draw on this passage here in specifically 15:6, where God says, or where it is noted that then he said to him, or then Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. There was nothing more that Abram had to do. We will know this as that justification of faith. Someone's phone? Heralding that in? Okay. As long I was wondering, if you have your new bell tower. I said, well, maybe it's your bell tower. So we have this dream. God is all in. He is reinforcing his message of promise that you will have descendants, you will have an heir. But he's also engaging in Abram's intellect, because not everything is clear all at once. Because the flaming pots and the torches passing through between these sacrifices allows for this sense of interpretation. Abram is given the ability to grow. It isn't just final and complete, but it stays with him, and he turns it over. And why it's so significant in his life that he's going to tell others about this eventually, because there's no other way anyone would know what's happened here unless Abram has spoken to others. That this has really stayed with him as a significant moment in his time. And it demonstrates the seriousness of the covenant. This covenant that God has made between Abram, promising the land to the people. What we miss in there, and you would note, is that passage misses, and the reason they took it out, frankly, is because it's distracting to the message, because those verses that we skipped over refer to the time of the Israelites in Egypt, and the 400 years that they're going to be there. That God is even there saying and telling and foreshadowing, forewarning that the Israelites will be in exile and that they will one day, God will bring them out of Egypt. So what does this matter to all of us? Well, it reinforces the promise, that message of promise made there, yes, to the land, but we as Christians look at this as foreshadowing of Jesus' promise to us, and that what God made to us through the resurrection of Christ. It opens our thinking to the breadth of divine communication. The ways that God can communicate with us are not just fixed, not just in the Word, though that is important, the Bible and the written Word, and is sufficient. But God can step out of those ways, and God is free to communicate with us whichever way that God chooses. It also shows us the mystical realm, that not everything in the world is set just as we see it. As I was driving over this morning and looking at the pink that was the sun on the hills just as it was coming up, the trees were, and the snow was pink, I was reminded that as this familiar drive that I've made so many times, that it was, everything was there as it should have been. The turn in the road was just as I remembered it. The stop sign was where it was. The stores, the markets were where they were supposed to be. That's our rational physical world. It's predictable. It's something that we can lean on and we understand to be true. But there's another world, another realm, if you will, that is more challenging for us to understand, and that is the mystical realm. And here is it tied into this very important promise made to Abram, is the signs of a mystical world that can shape and change us profoundly. It is full, that world is full of signs and symbols that give us the opportunity to interpret them, and they can help us grow and expand our understanding of what it is to be human. It shows that God rewards our faithfulness and also accepts our offerings. That God calls us to make offerings and God will accept them, and as best and as much as they are. I have an encounter and a conversation with a man once. He's just about 80 years old now, and we were talking one day, and he said to me, this was a number of years ago now. He said, I was awoken one morning, early in the morning, to a light in my bedroom, and it was startling to me. And he was just struck in fear of what it was. He said, well, he looked out the window and said, it's not light yet, it's not morning, and the sun hasn't risen. And the light was coming from within the room. He didn't have any lights turned on in his room. And in that moment, he heard a voice that he interpreted as God, and said to him, Jim, what have you done for me? And it stayed with him. And he wasn't sure what to make of this. He interpreted it as God. And as such, he in his trying to understand what that dream meant, he took it as that he was supposed to go back to church, that he hadn't been to church in a long time, and he needed to re-engage his spiritual life. And he began to do so, and really committed himself to church and And I know him well enough to know that he's become a regular attendee at the church he's at. In fact, I was, with our weather, it was quite wintry yesterday, and I just chose not to go down to the ordination for the deacons in the city, though I knew one or two of them and had wanted to, but I said, with the way this was going to be a mess, and I said I wasn't going to do that. So I was watching online, which is one of the benefits, right, of our time. So there I am watching the ordination service online, and I look in, they pan the audience that's there, and lo and behold, I see Jim sitting there. That he had made his commitment to be with one of the ordinands that as they were getting ordained, and this was coming from a man who had really walked away from church for a long time, but one night God had made his presence known to him and asked him what would he do for him. And he has dedicated himself to the life of the church and has thoroughly enjoyed himself doing so. Now, flames are not always such terrifying events in dreams. John of the Cross, the 16th century, 1500s Spanish mystic, wrote a poem, and in that poem he talks about the spiritual flame, and he it's a beautiful poem, but also he interprets the poem, which is a gift to all of us. Most poets are like, you know what, you can figure it out for yourself. I'm not going to talk to you about what this poem means. And so, but he did, and partly because he wrote these poems, and they were there for these novices, and he was training and these to become monks and nuns. And so he said to the one about this, as he talked about the lamps of fire, and he was referring both to the lamps that Moses saw and the lamp of the flame and the oven, if you will, that the smoking fire pot that Abram saw. And so he writes to this and says of these lamps of fire, those who were once obscure and blind can now receive illumination and warmth of love. As they do, so as to be able to give forth light and love to the one who illumined them and filled them with love. So not only is the fire to be that of disorienting and overwhelming one's senses, but it also gives light and warmth that we can share. And as John of the Cross says, well, where do we return that light and warmth? To the one who gave it, back to God in that praise and worship of God. And so it's different than what Abram received in his vision, but it is no less powerful in this sense of union with God cannot just be a terrifying event, but also can be an event filled with love and warmth. And so John of the Cross concludes by saying, I am yours and for you, and delighted to be what I am, so as to be yours and give myself to you. God can communicate with all of us and does so through speech and with Abram and through dream by which he makes a covenant. And he affirms and binds it through that dream, even showing the terrifying power that God has. God can choose when and how and why to communicate with people, to any one of us in any way. It can be like a smoking oven or a torch that can be disorienting, or it can be the flame of light and love. Our objective is to be open to it and attentive and ready to hear God's voice and allow that vision to happen to us and come upon us, and then simply to allow it to change us.